Hello everyone and welcome to my second video on the endgame important techniques. In the past I was extremely busy so I wasn't able to post another video, but today I'm back here and then I'm going to be talking about the power of the pawn pair. Specifically with the pawn pair, which I think is a much better name than the other names it is given, such as a pair of pawns or two consecutive pawns. The pawn pair just sounds so much better, so that's what I'm going to be calling it from now on. So why is the pawn pair so powerful, and what does it do exactly? Well, firstly, the pawn pair allows you to win in almost every single endgame. I have a lot of proof for this, and I can take you through it step by step. Firstly, we're going to look at, as you can see here, the basic king and pawn endgame, where white has two consecutive pawns. Most of you probably know how to win this by now, so I'm just going to go through a quick run through. King f2, for example. Black brings his king up, and white brings his king up first. Black waits, you push your pawns. Black waits, you push your pawns. Give a check, you bring your king continuing. King to7, you bring your king back. King f7, you bring your king here. King f8, g5, king g8, king g6. King f8, h6. King g8, king f6, king f8, for example, and h7, and your pawns will be promoted. Now, back here, even though without the h2 pawn, your king will be able to reach the g4 square first. And because you're able to reach the g4 square first, it means that you're going to have a much better chance of winning this game. So what does this mean specifically? Well, in this endgame, the two pawns don't matter much. But once you start adding some pieces, it's going to matter a lot more. Here we have the traditional knight endgame. Now, at first sight, this knight endgame doesn't seem like it's very hard to play. However, we do need caution. With two pawns, this endgame makes it a lot easier than if the pawns are split. And there's a very easy explanation why, and that is these two pawns can protect each other. White starts off with the same fashion. King f2, king f7, king f3, king f6. But now king f4 can be met with a knight check. We don't want this knight checking our king all the time. So instead, we play knight e3. We bring our knight in first. Black will probably do the same. And here we have a choice between which pawn to push. Because the knight on g5 gives the check, we want to play the move h4. It's strategic and make sure that the black knight is unable to land on this square. Knight d4 check is simply not as strong because we can play king e4, and now the knight cannot go to f5 because we're protecting that square, and it cannot go to f3 because we're also protecting that square, and like that. If knight goes to e2, it's not attacking any of these pawns, so we don't need to be worried about this move. So, instead, when we're back here, black probably will play the move king e5. It looks natural because you're stabilizing the king. Here, white should play the move king g4. I've stated this in one of my previous videos before, but in case you haven't watched that video on knight endgames, the king with this box against the knight, specifically these three squares over here, these allow the knight over here the most amount of moves to get to the king while the king still dominates a few of the knight's positions. What does that mean exactly? It means after two moves, this knight has no way of checking this king. In fact, it'll take 3 moves to do so. For such a short distance, this is an awful lot of time. I would call this a very important square, so when the knight's on e6, the corresponding squares where you would like to place your king would be g4, g8, c4, c8, and c4. In this position, however, it's a lot more different. Why? Because with these two pawns, this knight will probably never get a single check in this game before black loses. And as you can see, white is going to be able to do that. So what can black do here? Well, black doesn't want his knight on e6 anymore. So let's say black plays move knight d4. Now, as you can see, white needs to bring this g-pawn into the game, but for now, the g-pawn is good where it is. We can play g4 in one move, and while the king's on g4, you can't really do that. So in this position, let's just say white plays move h5. The move h5 is just a standard pawn move and allows black to come back with attention. Here, we can play the move king h4. And as you can see, this is where this g2 pawn is playing into hand. It's not allowing to move knight f3 check. Now the 5 check is obviously going to be simplified, and then white wins easily in the pawn game, as we saw in the previous example. In this position, there's simply no way for black to proceed. If black plays the move king g7, we can push with g4. Now, black will probably play the move knight f3 check in this position. And then we can play the move king g3. After knight comes to g5, we can play king f4. And after knight h3 check, for example, we can play king f5. Again, with this same structure against the knight on h3. 2 blocks diagonally across. Now this king is in the perfect position to win. If, let's say, black plays the move king h6 to stop g5, white can play the move knight d5. The main point of this move is to try to get a knight f4, and then, once this knight moves away, to play g5 while the knight's protecting the pawn in h5. So in case you can't visualize this right now, let's just say black plays the move knight g1, then white can play the move knight f4, and after black plays the move knight f3, white can play the move king f6, and let's say black moves his knight again. Now white can play g5 check, with the knight protecting this pawn over here, and the king's checked, and everything's protected from white's point of view. But obviously, knight g1 is not the best move for black. Black would probably play something like king h7. Here you can play the move g5 now, and after the move knight f2, for example, knight f6 check, king h8, h6. Now the king is stalemated, but there's no way for black to actually sacrifice this knight. Because if knight e4 or knight g4, white can always take with the knight instead. So let's say black plays the move knight h3. Now, white can play the move g6. And as you can clearly see, because these pawns will protect each other on g7, these pawns will be a lot better than separated pawns. And now g7 mate in 1 is unstoppable. So let's say black plays knight g5, g7 mate is on the board. So that's basically how we mated black, and it only took less than 20 moves, so it didn't take that long for these pawns to show how strong they were. Now, we are going to start entering the 3 drawing endgames that are still single-pieced. Let's start off with the bishop endgame. Now, I made these bishops the same color bishop, but in opposite color bishops, it would be much harder to win, and white would easily screw up. But in same color bishop endgames, which is predominantly most of the bishop endgames that you would face, the 2 consecutive pawns dominate strategically very well. So, how should white start? White's goal here is to control as many dark squares as with his pawns, and use his bishop and king to control all the light squares. So, white should start off with the move h4. The move h4 has its upsides. It protects against g5, which is a dark square, and then it allows white's king to traverse in via the dark squares as well. Let's say here black plays move king g7. White now can play the move g4. Whenever these 2 pawns are like this, it forms a blockade against the king, which is another trait of 2 consecutive passed pawns. Because if this pawn was on f4, then both f5 and h5 would be under attack, and the f4 and h4 pawns would be less stable. In fact, if the pawns were separated, same colored bishop endgames might end up in a draw. And that's not what we want. We want to win. So here, black can play the move bishop e6. Now, we want to keep this pawn structure, but alas, in this particular position, we can't. And see for yourself why we can't. Why can't white just play bishop e2 or bishop h3 in this position? Take some time. Well, if you saw this at first sight, congratulations. If you took some time to figure it out, no problem. You're still learning how to play these endgames. Why doesn't bishop e2 work? Because black can just simply take this pawn. And after bishop takes g4, as you can see in this position, there's a pawn in h4, but its queening square is a dark square. This bishop right here is a light squared bishop. Now we have a wrong rook's pawn bishop endgame, and this is a draw. For example, black just plays the move king h8. Now black's gonna pre-move in whatever type of position this is. King g7, king h8, king g7, king h8, king g7, king h8, king g7, king h8. There's nothing white can do in this position. You can see for yourself, but because we're talking about the pawn pair, not a singular pawn in this video, I'm not going to be going through so much detail. But we're back in bishop e6 position, and white should play the move g5. Now, as you can see, if we quickly calculate this, if king g6, white has the ability of playing king f2, and after king h5, king g3. This is actually what black should be doing right now. But as you can see, these pawns are on dark squares. That's our goal. Now we can play bishop e2 check. So in this position, black can probably just play the move bishop f5. We play bishop e2 check, king g6, and now we can play the move king f4. Notice, we're going to be keeping our king on the dark squares the entire game. It's the best strategy. Now h5 check is being threatened. There's nothing black can do about it. Black can play the move bishop e6. After h5 check, black can play the move king g7. Now, here comes a slick idea. If you don't see this at first, then that's okay. But just keep in mind that these pawns need to always stay on the color that they are supposed to be on. So take your time, think about what white should be doing here most practically. Alright, so hopefully had a small think about this position. In this position, because we know that we want our pawns to be on dark squares, it's quite obvious the next pawn we want to push is the h-pawn. Because if we push the h-pawn, we will have pawns on g5 and h6, and they're both dark squares. Which is why in this position, we want to play the move h6 check first. We don't play g6, we play h6. After h6 in this position, if king g6, then white can play the move bishop d3 check. And as you can see, the power of the king on the dark squares is that it controls 4 light squares. All 4 of these. And the king does not block the bishop from checking. And also avoids the black's bishop from checking it. Now the king has to move out. And in this position, white can play the move king e5. And because these pawns are on dark squares, they control all of these T squares. Now f6, g7, the king controls e6 and d6. The bishop here controls f5, g6, and h7. As you can see, white controls a lot of squares. So what can black do in this position? g6 is being threatened right now. So here, black should probably play something like bishop b3. Now, we will play the move g6 check. And after king f8, now everything's quite straightforward. Both of these pawns are here, so we have a few moves to choose from. We can play the move g7 immediately, and say black plays move king f7. Now we can play the move bishop e4, threatening bishop d5 check for the win. After black plays move king e7, we play bishop d5, takes, king f7, king e5, king g8, king f6, king h7, king f7, takes, queen, king h5, queen g3, king h6, queen g6 mate. As you can see, that didn't take long at all. And same color bishops are usually, and actually quite predominantly, drawn when there aren't 2 consecutive pawns, if white does not play correctly. But as you can see, with the pair of pawns, we won easily. Next, we come to the most common endgame, the hardest endgame to play for most people, and that's the rook endgame. Now, the rook endgame is really, really difficult. However, with 2 consecutive pawns, it isn't at all. So, in the rook endgame, when you have 2 consecutive pawns, the main goal is to make sure your king is close to the pawns at all times and takes cover behind them. Again, here, white wants to try to control as many squares as possible with his rook as well. So a very good starting move would be the move rook e7. It makes a lot of sense because we don't want that king to move around all of the time. So we start off by cutting the king over. Note that these positions are very unrealistic, but they can take place quite often with the style of the 2 consecutive pawns, and they will usually transpose sooner or later in the later game. In this position, black has a multitude of moves, but let's say black plays rook a8. That way black has the maximum checking distance horizontally. Here, we want the king to be hiding from the rook. We can't hide from the cross checks with the h-pawn, but we can with the g-pawn. This means we want to push the h-pawn now, so that after rook a1 check, the king can hide behind the g-pawn. Now there's no checks. Black can try to cut off with rook a3, but now we can play the move g3. Now the h3 square is a safe spot. However, after rook a2 and king h3, what do we do after black plays the move rook a1? Because now black can check this way and this way. Whoops, and this way. The key thing to notice that is that if black's rook is on the h file, then it cannot come to the a file anymore. And if black's rook is not on the first rank, then it cannot come to the first rank and h file at the same time. This rook is not a queen. This means, very easily, you can just wait. You can play the move h5, for example. If the move rook h1 plays check, now we play king g4. We use the g-pawn as shelter this way instead, and not this way, because we don't need to. Because the rook isn't teleporting to a4. It can't. So now let's say the rook comes back. Now what do? We play the exact same strategy we had before. We move our king to h4. This is a really subtle move. Because if rook a4 check is played, white plays g4. And if rook h1 is played, white can play the move king g5 here. Now what's so special about king g5, you might say? Well, now the g-pawn can be pushed. And this means if the rook comes back to a1, preparing to check horizontally, white plays g4, and after rook check, the king comes back to h4. And now, as you can see, the king's completely sheltered again because the g-pawn's on g4 already. So in this position, black's rook comes back to a1, thinking that black can check again. But now, as you've probably seen by now, we repeat the exact same process. We play the move h6. And now after h6, black can play the move rook h1 check. And after king g5, black can play rook a1. King h5, black can play rook g1 check. And as you can see in this late game, rook h1 check is simply a bad move. Because after king g6 and rook a1, you don't need to play this g5 move anymore. You just play rook e8 check and it's mate. This means, instead of playing rook h1 check, black should try the last rank defense. And specifically what this is black plays rook a6. This stops the king from coming to g6, and black wants to try to get stalemate threats. For example, a very, very common mistake here, that even I've played before, is white playing rook h7 check in this position. This is a huge mistake. Now, black plays the move king h8, and white has no way of winning. It looks like white's just going to play g5, g6, king h8, rook e8 mate, and it's going to be game over. That's not exactly what happens, because if you notice clearly, what can black play to save this position right now? There's actually a multitude of ways to save the position, but the most fashionable, if I may say so, is move rook h6 check. And if you've seen before, this king is completely stalemated. And this means black can play this rook wherever he wants. After, for example, king g4, you could take on h7, and that's just going to be a draw. However, you can play even better than that. You can play move rook h4 check. And there's nothing white can actually do about this. Because in order for white to break the stalemate checks, the king needs to be at least 2 squares away from this rook. That way the pawn can be pushed or the rook can be coming to block. But as long as this rook stays directly close to the king, there's nothing that the king can use to block. And this means, when king f5 is played, rook f4, king g6, rook f6, king h5, rook h6, king g4, rook h4, king f3, rook f4, king e3. Now, as you can see, the rook's guarding e4, so what do? We play rook f3. King d4, rook d3. King c5, rook c3. As you can see, there is no really blockade. But if you want to be the person who enjoys following the details, you would play rook d5 here. King c6, rook d6, king c7, rook c6, king d7, rook c8, and yeah, these checks just keep on going. There's nothing really white can do about this. There's nothing really going on. So yeah, that's why in that particular position, back here, don't play h7, because you'll get the king stalemated. And specifically, try to avoid putting your pawns on a 7th rank. That's a very common misconception. So in this position, just slow down and play the move g5. Now let's say black plays rook b6. This defense is usually the best one. And here, there are a multitude of ways to play, but personally, I prefer the move that I'm going to be showing you right now. And this is the move, rook e5. Now, this may seem a bit counterintuitive at first, but it really isn't. Rook e5, it looks like it allows king h7, but that actually loses on the spot, because white can play the move g6 check here. And after rook takes g6, rook e7 check, hits the king. If the king moves back, the rook's lost, and then rook g7, you just take the rook for free. And now, black's lost. And just to finish it off, king h8, rook f7, king g8, king g6, king here, mate. So king h7, as we see, doesn't work. And because it doesn't work, what do you do as black? In this position, you can play king f7. And note, after king f7, a big important part is that g6 still works. Because after rook takes, you do not play rook f5 check. You gotta make sure you do not play this move. Because after rook f6, this pawn game is actually still drawn. Because the king has no way of advancing anymore. So you don't play rook f5. You also don't play move h7. This move looks really tempting because it looks like black has no way of defending the queen, right? If the king comes, you just queen, and then you take the rook. And if the rook comes, you just take the rook and you mate. However, the rook doesn't need to go this way. Who said the rook can go that way? The rook has 4 directions to move in. And this direction is completely free. And as you can see, there's nothing really white can do about this anymore. King g7 is the immediate threat of stopping this pawn. If you queen, rook h1 check, forks the queen, and then have a rook versus rook endgame. If you promote to a knight, after king g7, that knight's lost. So you aren't even going to be getting an advantage in this position. And because of this, it seems like there isn't really a way to win. However, there is, and that move is rook e7 check. Now, if the king still tries to hang on to this rook, rook e6 check forces black's hand. If king takes, then king takes g6, king f8, h7. And now, white's going to be able to promote now. And once white promotes, white wins. So, that's how g6 works, because after rook takes g6, there's the move rook e7 check. In this position, black cannot move his king up. So what does black do? Black moves his king rook on 6th rank because he still wants to prevent the move king g6. Now, this is the key move why I prefer rook e5 over all moves. You play g6. Now, the rook has no check on the a file. If instead, in this position, the rook went to b1, now, you can still do the exact same thing. You move your rook again, and now black is stuck with a good move. If black plays the move rook c1, you now can play the move rook a8 check. After king f7, g6 check, and now the king is not coming to d squares anymore. The king's out of bounds. This means black's rook needs to come back to the back rank to defend the position. Because the rook needs to come to the back rank, you can see now there is no check here. And speaking of which, if rook h1 check was played here, then white can just play king g6, and black has no check anymore. So yeah, but if the rook comes back, white can play the move g6. The rook on a5 is still defending this rank, so there's no rook b5 check. Nonsense. Now, black has to move his king or move his rook. Both don't matter. If rook c8, for example, white just plays the move h7 check. And after king g7, white can play the move rook f5. This threatens rook f7 check. And black can only wait. If black plays the move rook c7, white can still play rook f7 check. So that hasn't changed. And if black just waits on the back rank, rook f7 check, king h8. And now, finally, white can play the move king h6. This looks like the king's being stalemated, but there's no way for black to sacrifice his rook. And finally, if black tries to play rook g8, because this stops a main one, you can take on h8 if you want. Yeah, if you can take on g8 if you want. But just to finish it off for style, they're the only mate in 2 combination. Take your time and hopefully you can spot it. There's only one mate in 2. There are a couple mate in 3s, but only one mate in 2. Alright, so if you spot it, congratulations. The final finisher move is rook f8. This forces rook takes f8 and g7 check with our beloved pawn pair, as we've been discussing this entire video, seals the deal. And that's basically how you win this position, with rook and rook against 2 pawns. Alright, so this video has probably been a bit long for most of you, but we still haven't covered one last endgame, and that's the queen endgame, obviously. In the queen endgame, it's a lot harder because you might get perpetual checked. However, if you remember to bring your king and these pawns close together, your position won't fail. So, a very important idea in queen endgames is the theme of centralization. This is moving your queen closer to the center of the board such that it controls the most squares possible. In this position, the first move is actually quite obvious, just queen d5 check. The queen's in the center 4 squares and it still checks the king. After we move king g7 in this position, white can start moving the king, king f2. Now, black actually only has one check in this position, that's the move queen f8. And after white plays the move king g3, black only has a few checks. Queen a3 probably going to be the best one. And after white plays the move king g4, queen a4 check, king f3, queen a3 check, king e4. And now here, if black checks here, queen d4 is another check, and then black is forced to trade queens. And black has no other checks. Because of queen e7 or queen b4, there's a queen e5 or d4 check. So here, black's, let's say, played the move queen c1. Now, we push our pawns. We play h4. And you need to calculate that this queen has no way of taking one of your pawns. But in this particular position, it's fine. For example, if the move queen e1 is played, white can play the move king f5. In this move, queen takes h4 is played. White has this beautiful tactical finish. Queen d7 check, king h6, queen e6 check, king g7, queen g6 check, and after wherever the king moves, queen f6 check, trades the queens. And this is an unavoidable process for black. There's simply no way for black to really avoid the queen coming in. If, for example, king g8 is played, then the move queen e6 check is still possible. In this position, after king f8, queen f6, trade. And finally, if the king comes to f8, queen d6 check, king e8, queen e6 check, king d8, queen f6 is a trade again. So as you can see, black can't really avoid that trade, which is why taking on h4 does not work. However, if you don't want to calculate too much, in this position, you can just play the move h3. Now, h3 is obviously a lot slower because h4 is moving 2 moves instead of once. But now the queen will be protecting g2 once the queen checks this king. And then this pawn protects this pawn, the queen protects these pawns, so you won't lose a single pawn. But we like active play here, so we play h4. After queen e1 check king f5, we see that queen takes h4 is not possible. And after the move queen f2, we can play the move queen f3. Now, again, if queen takes h4, queen g4 check trades the queens. So we move queen c5 check, for example. After king g4, here, black has no useful check. If queen d4 check, just queen f4. And after queen d1 check, just king h3. And there's no other check. If queen h1 check, then just queen h2, and there's no check after that. And the queen's worse on h1. So let's say king h7 is played. Now white wants to try to push the h pawn up and keep the g2 pawn here so the king has maximum protection. So let's say queen f5 check is played. Now after king h6 check, white can play queen g5 check. After king h7, white can play the move h5. And now, as you can see, white's just slowly but steadily advancing. If queen e3, no, not queen e2, queen d3 check, white can play the move g3. Actually, no, white can't play the move g3, white because of queen f1 check, but white can play the move queen g3. After queen f5 check, king h4, queen e4 check, queen g4. The queen's protecting both pawns now. And after queen e1 check, now white can play g3. And after queen h1 check, king g5. And as you can see here, queen d5 check does not work because of queen f5 check. And after queen c1, queen f4, queen c5 check does not work because of queen f5 check. So here black just needs to move the queen. And finally, now white can start to finish her. Queen f7 check, king h8, queen f8 check, king h7, queen e7 check, king h8. So now we made sure that there's no stalemate possibilities. Queen e5 check, king g8, and here h6. Now, queen g7 is the immediate mate threat, so black has to check as much as he can. However, after just one check, say the move queen d8 check, after king h5, queen d1, king h4, where's the checks? Black's running out of checks extremely quickly. After, let's say, the move queen a4 is played, just simply g4, and now black is out of checks completely. Black has to defend against the g7 threat, and black plays move queen d7. But white doesn't care anymore. White just trades off the queens. And now white, as you can see, is clearly winning because white has the opposition. And this basic endgame knowledge stuff you should know. If you don't know this by now, you need to check out a few of my videos in my past time about pawn endgames. They were quite old because I've changed a lot, obviously, but they will be really helpful for you. So that wraps up the power of the pawn pair, and specifically how consecutive pawns make it so much easier to win endgames. Normally in the queen endgame, you're going to need a lot of gas, a lot of strength, a lot of stamina, a lot of everything to win. But with two pawns, the only thing you need is a bit of calculation and you're all good. So, how would two pawns fare against another piece without any other help? Well, here's a very famous example about two pawns against the rook. And after this, we'll wrap it up for today. And then in the next week, we will be specifically talking about techniques in rook endgames. I honestly don't know when I'm posting my next video, so just keep that in mind. However, anyways, there are too few combinations of pawns. And we're only going to be talking about one of them. And that's, for example, in this position is white to move and win. White moves to move h7. And when white has a pawn in 5th rank and 7th rank, for black it's the 4th rank and 2nd rank, white wins with the pawns. Because after rook h2, white can play g6. After rook h6, g7 takes, and white gets a queen. And I've covered how to win a queen versus rook endgame before, and you guys should know that by now. But if you guys don't, you guys can check that out also. It's on my endgame techniques 1, the wall. And if that doesn't satisfy you enough, it also works out if, let's say, the rook was over here. So let's just say king f4 and the rook was here. And let's say here, white plays move g6. The two pawns on the 3rd rank are also winning positions. After rook g2, h7, rook h2, g7. And these two pawns, at least one of them is going to queen. So that wraps it up for this week. I'll see you next time. If you enjoyed this video, you can feel free to like, share, or subscribe. And I will be posting content like this in the future. If you like my new layout for these videos, then feel free to tell me in the comments because I'm still a young YouTuber trying to improve everything.